you just came from a class. Which class was that?
Oh, I'm going to a class, in fact. So
Excellent.
so this will be 22 minutes of quality infotainment, and then there'll be 3 hours of quality infotainment for the 1112 Public Law and Statutory Interpretation class. It's Judges Powers Week.
Excellent. That sounds like fun. So, how did you get to where you are now?
Okay, so this is as always, it's a long story with lots of detours. By the way, the advice for people who wanted to get into academia is there's no advice to give. Academia chooses you. You would randomly fall into it. It's nothing to do with necessarily being the best student. It's nothing to do with necessarily having a career plan. In fact, one of the things I'm going to talk about today to the students, I'm going to take my cans off because I realise that actually I can't really hear through them anyway. So one of the things about teaching public law is that a lot of students say, well, so why did judges take a pay cut? Because almost inevitably every judge ends up taking a pay cut unless they're a very struggling criminal barrister.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing for academia. You know, the people who are paid best are obviously people who are either star barristers or equity partners in law firms. And I never did any of those things. I did my master's and bachelor's degrees at the London School of Economics in London in the UK back in the late 80s. Everyone can probably hear I'm a POM. Came over to Australia for the first time in 99 to do a fellowship at the University of Melbourne. At that point I was a lecturer at the University of Warwick in the UK. Warwick's actually one of our alliance partners. So randomly I was back at Warwick last year, 25 years on. Hasn't changed. Same place, not very glamorous, but nice parkland campus. And then after that, I did actually spend some time in practice. So I was in practice in 3 different ways. I was the advisor to the special advisor, as they call it, or SPAD, as it's often known. I was a special advisor to the head of the broadcast regulator in the UK. And then after that, I became the regulatory director of a very large telecoms company that became a spectacular bankruptcy. It's actually the largest corporate bankruptcy in history at the time.
Wow.
Since been overtaken by about 50 others, I should add. So that was in 2002. That was a company called WorldCom, also known as WorldCon, after the bankruptcy. And also spent some time working for probably the only real think tank. A lot of things are out there called think tanks, and they're really political propaganda organizations. But there is an organisation called the RAND Corporation. And you will have heard of the RAND Corporation's particular speciality because they were very, very keen on discovering the unknown unknowns. What later became known as black swan events, although of course that's a very Northern Hemisphere biased saying, given that most swans in Australia are black swans. But yeah, so they were the unknown unknowns people. They also brought us the theory of mutually assured nuclear destruction, the MAD theory. And then after that, I realised that I had worked in some very interesting places, but what I really liked most was researching and writing and giving governments unbiased opinions, which is vanishingly rare, both in London and in Canberra and in Melbourne. So I went back into academia in 2007. I became a professor at the University of Essex, which, like Monash, is a 1960s university. Actually, I went from Warwick, which is a 1960s university, to Essex, which is a 1960s university, via doing my degrees at LSE, which is an 1890s but prototype 1960s university. And then I moved in 2013 to Sussex, which is also a 1960s university, near Brighton, for those of you who know the UK. And then from there, moved to Monash in 2022 and became Professor of AI, technology and the law. The comma is just in case AI became a busted flush. And it meant I'd still have a job at the end of it. And that kind of brings us to 2025.
Incredible. So I just wanted to drill down into providing unbiased views. How do you do that?
You don't take money off people. So there's 2 parts of that which are important. The first is don't do sponsored research directly. Indirectly can be okay, but it can be tricky. And academics have this kind of hit list of who are the foundations that are good to take money off and not, depending on whether they interfere with what you want to do. And the second part of that is try and get funded by... Australia is very interesting. We have a lot of funding for academics coming directly from departments, Department of Industry, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is sort of, to some extent it's tied research, but you have quite a lot of independence. But then the gold standard is Australian Research Council funding. And I sit on the College of Experts of the Australian Research Council. I was appointed last year to that. What we get to do on the Australian Research Council is do lots of evaluation of applications for bidding. So basically, if we don't do enough marking in our academic jobs, we get to do loads more marking of other academics at the Australian Research Council. So it's a bit like a lot of students say to me, well, you know, if I go and work in a law firm, I basically just do 2,800 hours a year for the next 20 years, and then the prize for becoming a partner is doing even more hours if you want to after that. So academics have the kind of same thing, which is you do marking and marking and marking, and then if you're successful you do even more marking, but this time it's not just of students, it's of other academics. That's a long way of saying it's very hard to do independent research. Of course, the best independent research is really that's commissioned by government itself to solve a particular problem. Like the example we're talking about in class later on today is the under-16 social media ban, where government really didn't want unbiased research, because that would be terrifying.
It's an interesting point you raised, because it seems as if people think the only way to gain credible knowledge is through a decentralized model where lots and lots of people pull together to provide a source of truth, as opposed to sort of one centralized source of truth.
Well, when you think about it, if you're doing a long research project, and this happens more at master's and HDR level, I guess, than at undergrad, but a lot of undergrads do a long dissertation. And when you're doing that, your 20 main sources are, and this will sound absolutely tragic, but they kind of become your confidants. You know, you're basically discussing in your head, at least, what you think versus, you know, you've taken the AI unit. So, you know, what would Michael Veal think? What would Lillian Edwards think? What would X, Y, and Z think? In my case, it's slightly less tragic because I actually do know these guys and we do have these conversations. But in actual fact, you're always thinking, you know, what would Lon Fuller think? What would A.W. Dicey think? I know he's been dead a long time. But what would Tom Bingham think? He's alive. So I think that discussion you have with your sources actually is something which is taking place. You know, it doesn't have to be a living and breathing source. It's a lot more interesting if you can speak to a living, breathing source, if they're willing to tell you the truth, of course. Which is why it's very difficult interviewing government ministers or spats.
So as your telecom experience, has that like allowed you to kind of get into this area or not?
No, absolutely it has. I gave a talk yesterday to the Telecommunications Society of Australia, which is a 151-year-old learned society, so it's older than the actual Federation of Australia itself. And I was talking about AI sovereignty, the notion of whether Australia should be trying to have more control over data centres and, well, chip manufacturing is going to be a struggle, but some of the other aspects of AI. And I come to that very much from having come from telecoms and then via internet and understanding that there's like a technology stack, right? You don't have AI unless you have connectivity and unless you have computing power and unless you have, and also of course humans, right? And so I think understanding that, and also understanding, I think, previous technologies and the attempts by companies to pretend that you don't need to regulate it because you can trust us to self-regulate. I think when you've been around around this cycle a couple of times, you recognise the lines. And one of the problems that I think we have in Australia and the world is that the politicians haven't been around technology cycles. So they have a tendency to think it's all magic. It's not magic, it's just a lot of computing power and a lot of data. And a lot of that data is actually yours and mine. So yeah, no, I think it really helps to understand how the game has been played in the past and to understand that history repeats itself.
Yeah. So what cycle are we in right now?
Oh, we're at the top of the bubble. I've actually got a talk I gave to the Brookings Institute in Washington, which is another one of those very old think tanks. And I talked about the AI bubble of 2027 and how it would explode and lead to basically a few monopoly companies being left there holding the parcel when the music stops. And clearly OpenAI, the guys who brought you ChatGPT, they're clearly thinking that as well, because Sam Altman, who's their chief executive, recently said, oh, there's a bubble, there's far too much speculation, meaning that he thinks he's going to be one of the people obviously still afloat when the whole thing goes down.
Well, I think an argument that a lot of people make with the original .com bubble is that, you know, whilst a lot of it was speculative investments, it was almost this speculation and like ability to just do kind of random things that still created a lot of the innovation that, you know, 10, 20 years after we benefit from.
And I mean, in lots of ways. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of fibre stuck in the ground, and the fibre was very useful. We filled it eventually. There was also a lot of realisation that we needed broadband, and Australia has a particular history with, obviously, the NBN, which is pretty much unique in the developed world to actually have a government, effectively a government-owned and funded backbone network in that way. So yeah, I think a lot of things were realised, and you know, a lot of startups turned out to later be useful, and a lot turned out to not be useful. I didn't mention one of my other explorations in the commercial world was I was actually the general counsel of a startup company. And 5 years after, well, I say startup, but let's call it a shutdown. And 5 years after it shut down, I was a one-time entrepreneur, not a serial entrepreneur. So 5 years after it shut down, my mother said to me, she said, "I've just seen this thing called YouTube. Isn't that more or less what you were trying to do 5 years ago?" "Yes, Mum, but we were trying to follow copyright law." And that was the mistake we made.
Right. So sometimes playing by the rules isn't the right thing.
Yeah, what do they talk about? You know, best mover advantage, and they talk about, you know, having an effective regulatory strategy, which in the case of companies like Uber and Airbnb is largely evade the regulations and then shape them in your interest.
Being too sort of litigious or legalistic about things can be a hindrance.
That makes it really tricky to be general counsel of a company, though, of course, or regulatory counsel, because you're trying to advise the company to obey the law, but at the same time to be able to achieve their business model. And so you face some pretty large ethical dilemmas about explaining to them what the law is, what they might get caught for, what won't get enforced, and yet at the same time try and stay on the right side of your ethical responsibilities as a lawyer. And I know that our dean and also our new professor, Richard Moorhead, have done a lot of work looking at the ethical responsibilities and how they failed in things like the post office scandal in the UK and the robo-debt scandal over here, of course. And so it's really tricky because, yes, you would like to advise your client in this case is the company, that, you know, you don't have to follow these regulations to the letter. Listen to me trying to construct the right form of words. Not advising your client you can break the law, and that's really hard.
Yes.
It comes with experience. There's a limit to how much you can teach that.
How do you sort of direct people moving forward into the future workforce? What sort of advice do you give to people they're entering either sort of legal, academic, or some other field?
Well, the first is don't panic about AI, because effectively all of us are going to be supervising our AI assistant from the moment we step into, whether you're working in-house or in a law firm or in government or wherever else. And so, yeah, you need to work with AI, but you don't need to panic about AI. It's not about to take away skilled lawyers' jobs, because, as we know, it makes stuff up. It doesn't know it's making stuff up because it's just a prediction engine. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, we were actually recording this during clerkship week. So a lot of students are currently, talking to Allens and other firms and knowing that, you become a clerk and, or a clerk associate, and on we go. And so, the traditional routes work, but we're getting to the point where a lot more lawyers are employed not in law firms than inside law firms. So in-house or doing other things. I remember some great advice given by the chief executive of a very, very large company, who said, well, the great thing about a law degree is that you tend not to get ripped off by the lawyers as much when you become a business person. So I don't know if that's good or bad advice, but it's certainly one of the things they took away from a law degree is useful even if you don't become a lawyer.
Well, one thing I found interesting is like Peter Thiel, Palantir, or the PayPal Mafia, etc. You can disagree with them on what they do, but it's interesting, they all did law degrees. I expected them to have done engineering degrees, and I looked into it, that he'd actually done Bachelor of Arts, majoring in philosophy, and then he did a JD after. Admittedly at Yale, but still, like, it's interesting that people that we see at the forefront of technological innovation are people with a regulatory and kind of humanities background instead of
I think it's really useful. So in the States, of course, it's a postgraduate degree, a law JD, so they've already done, as you say, another degree at undergraduate level, and often with a major and a minor, so they've often done 2 other disciplines. I think at Monash it's great that almost all students do a joint honours. I think that's really, really important. And I think that it's, in the UK, I had a law degree from London School of Economics, which is a very good university, at 20 years old. I mean, really? You know, do you really want to take advice from a 20-year-old? I think there's a limit. Apologies to all the very wise 20-year-olds out there, but you know, most of us wouldn't take our own advice.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's daunting. Like, I'm 19, about to be 20 at the end of the year. I couldn't imagine starting to advise people.
You think, you know, legal advice at that stage, it's like, well, I think I'd like a little more life experience first, right?
Yes.
What's something maybe people misunderstand?
So I think the one thing that's really misunderstood by a lot of academics, which is interesting, is that when a government department or a regulator puts out a consultation, they put out a document and they ask for public feedback on that, they don't actually want public feedback at that stage. What they really want is feed forward before they ever got to that stage of the document. And so a lot of the work I've done over 20 years for governments, but particularly for the European Commission, where I was I've worked a lot with the European Commission, is that they would commission me to do research for them before they actually formulate a policy proposal. And that's the stage at which you want to influence policymakers. You don't want to influence them at the stage where they've just put out a public document saying, these are our options, because frankly there's always a 3-card trick, and I think I normally teach this in class, which is you give them the no regulation option, the too much regulation option, and the just the right amount of regulation option. It's Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? Everyone's going to go for the middle one.
Yes.
They've wised up to a bit now it's a 5-card trick, where it's nothing, not enough, the right amount, too much, and possibly a large amount. And so responding to a public consultation, which is what we would traditionally be calling impact in academia and policy, that's actually too late in the process to be done. So, you know, if anyone wants to influence policy, try to get in at the earliest possible stage. And there's a terrible kind of truth to that, which is that very often when government want you to actually give them advice, they will pay you for that in advance, because they actually want you to carry out research for them.
Right.
And so I've often got students to look at the 400 submissions in response to the government's consultation paper on should we have guardrails for AI. And honestly, they're all very nice, and some of them are very long. And in future, there'll be thousands, not hundreds. And they'll all just be read by ChatGPT, because they'll just feed them through some, or hopefully some slightly more reliable LLM. And so there won't even be a human reading these submissions at some point in the very near future. In the US, it's already going that way. So I think that's what people misunderstand. They assume that a consultation is a real consultation. And in most cases, it really isn't.
How do you view the public sector moving forward and adopting, or the government adopting AI?
Well, of course, the public sector is now regulating themselves for the use of AI as a result of the Royal Commission and accepting the recommendations, and therefore the public sector duties when it comes to making AI decisions, or automated decision making, as they call it. So they've effectively regulated themselves, and it's only the private sector that isn't regulated in those terms. I should say the private sector's biggest client is always government, because government's the biggest spender out there. So the private sector, to that extent, you know, large private companies that do business with government are trying to stay obviously compatible with government's own duties upon itself. I don't just mean federal, I mean state and even, you know, smaller institutions, or even large institutions like Monash. So there is a creeping, you know, if you would say to me how much AI is regulated in Australia, it's maybe, you know, a third to a half. It's increasing because of those public sector duties. When it comes to private sector companies with private sector business, you know, there's a lot of rogue work out there, particularly by the large American actors. And a lot of my students have just come off talking about whether or not TikTok should be banned in Australia. Their conclusion, by the way, was that data shouldn't be allowed out of Australia for any company, let alone TikTok. And so they gave a little bit of a blowback on that point by saying it should apply to Meta and Google and Apple and everybody. So I think that there are real issues there about the fact that by not having a generic AI law, what we've got is sort of creeping regulation through these other means. And maybe that's a good thing. But certainly when you're advising clients, it's a bit of a money spinner for lawyers, because life is much more complicated than it would be if we did just have some generic AI law that you could say, this is what you do, whether you're dealing with a public sector or private sector client, you're required to do these things.
Maybe the view from government would have been different decades ago with the way in which companies are using data now. But it seems, whether that be a cultural shift towards maybe a more lax approach of, you can take all my data. Do you think this has influenced the government's stance and will influence the government's stance on how we control data, how we regulate it?
I think it has done. I mean, we didn't have a privacy commissioner for more than a decade. The information commissioner was considered to be able to do that. So I should say this at the federal level. And so when Carly Kind was appointed at the start of 2024, that was our first privacy commissioner since the early 2010s. So certainly Australia has been one of the more lax regulators. I mean, to the extent that it doesn't have anything approaching an adequacy agreement with the European Commission, because the European Union doesn't believe Australia's privacy law is anything like strict enough to actually give regulatory reliability. Is there a cultural shift happening? I think that's a really difficult one. And Zuckerberg, because it's in his interests, of course, Mark Zuckerberg said, well, of course, privacy is over and people have a new cultural norm where they want to share data. And I talk to my students, I don't think that's entirely true. I think there's plenty of data that we'd like to keep private, not just obvious things like medical data, but I think a lot of relationship data and political and social and other views that you have. I think it's very much the case. Sensitive data is still sensitive data.
I'm curious, what's your reaction to regulations such as the Online Safety Act?
So and again, this doesn't help our students at Monash, because there's an Online Safety Act in the UK and there's exactly the same name for the law in Australia as well, but at least in Australia it's the Safety Commission, not the Ofcom, the Office of Communications of the UK, former client of mine. So I actually was subject to some of this about a month ago. For some of my social media settings, I adjust my location for social media settings. I think I always tell my students this, that I obviously realise that by using social media I'm putting a lot of personal data out there. I like to obfuscate. I like to use multiple browsers just to keep the advertisers on their toes about trying to target me. I also, of course, go through my privacy settings pretty carefully and try and shut off Gemini on my phone and all these things. So I think that one of the interesting things that will happen to us, and I should say this will happen on the 10th of December 2025, mark it in your calendars, because that's the day the under 16 social media ban comes in. That's the day we have to prove we're over 16. Now, I haven't been carded in a bar for a long time, so I'm figuring that I won't have too much of a problem if it does come to a live facial recognition check. But certainly when the UK introduced, it was called the Age Appropriate Design Code, which was about the way that the UK was enforcing its Online Safety Act. X just cut me off from content for 2 weeks. I checked the Q's and A's, and it said, well, we will do our own checks. You don't need to prove you're over 18. We're going to go do our own checks. It's 18 in the UK, not 16. And they said that we will check when your account was started up. I thought, well, whatever they're doing this with, it's not very good AI, because my account had been running since May 2009. So it's been running over 16 years. So the likelihood of me being under 18 is 0. And so I think that because what happens is they'll have to rely on the companies to enforce it. And this is going to be a major problem. Am I looking forward to the 10th of December? Well, of course I am, because I'm a researcher. So, the more pain I see out there, sometimes the better a story it tells. But yeah, it's going to be a mess. And the UK situation has been a mess as well, despite the fact that that's an easier to enforce 18. And they're not trying to ban under 18s from social media. They're just trying to make sure there's age-appropriate restrictions.
The thing I think about is just that balancing act between, autonomy to sort of do what you want to do online, insofar as it doesn't harm people, and then that sort of more paternalistic sort of we should look after you, we should sort of guide you as our government does in the physical world as it should in the virtual. So it is interesting to see where it'll go.
Should say, of course, advertisers know that those of us, particularly, Monash academics and students, we think we really know our own minds and we don't need any kind of paternalistic guidance from above. And the advertisers love that, because they know that we're all subject to the what's called the ocean test, which I think we went through. where they're trying to basically, essentially advertisers try and check how gullible or pliant you are. And the smarter you are, the more pliant you are, it turns out. So in other words, the easiest fool is the person who has no idea they're a fool. We'll need to wind up in a minute, but fire a last question at me and I'll do my best to answer.
One final piece of advice that you would give to students moving forward beyond university?
Oh, I think two things. I mean, the first is that whatever you do, make sure that it's something that you're enthusiastic about. I think getting out of bed in the morning is much, much easier when you actually like what you actually do. Helps if you like the people you're working with as well, but the most important thing is to like what you do, because you're going to be doing that for 10 hours a day, whoever's in the next cubicle or the next office. And I think the second one is, and I tell this to students actually in classes as well as for their future careers, 90% of success is turning up. You need to be prepared, that's the 10%, and you won't get far without the 10%, but turn up, be there. And so if it's, should I go to that career networking event, or should I go to something else, or should I go to that guest lecture, go to them. Because you'll be amazed, A, what you'll learn there, but B, what you'll learn just by talking to the person next to you sitting there. And so, really, turn up, you'll be amazed what you get out of it, as long as you're enthusiastic. If you turn up and you're bored and you're falling asleep, you might as well not be there. But as long as you have some enthusiasm and willingness to learn, I think it's just extremely good advice to expose yourself to as much information as possible.